Hello and welcome to yet another session. Lecture 2, Human Development. The demand for education and some aspects pertaining to health. In the previous lecture, we saw the importance of the concept of human capital and human development in the process of economic development. We also checked the importance of education as a means to achieve human development. However, we must understand that education must be a means and not an end in the process of economic development. Education policies must look into the appropriateness of education for well-being. In this session, we check about the demand for education, the cost-benefit aspects of education, the supply for education, education index and the area of health in human development, the cost-benefit aspects of health, supply of health facilities and some health indicators. The objectives for this session are to review the reason for the demand for education from the viewpoint of economics. Second, to analyze the private and social costs of education and how societies benefit from education. Third, to know if and how level of education of a nation can be quantified to measure development. Fourth, to evaluate the private and social costs and benefits of health. And last but not the least, to understand what is meant by good health. Now let us look into demand for education. The demand for education arises from prospective earnings from education, the private costs on education and the non-economic factors. The prospects of increasing earnings after education. If people do not see these prospects, they do not seek education. The demand for education is positively related to the wage differentials between the modern and the traditional sectors. There are instances where the traditional and unorganized sector provides more earning than the earning which higher education in developing countries can fetch. The demand for secondary level education is inversely related to the current unemployment rate. If the employment is easily available for the unskilled and less educated, the demand for education will be lesser. The second is the direct and the indirect costs of education which a student or her family must bear. If the costs of education are higher, the demand for education is lesser and vice versa. Now, the demand for education is inversely related to the direct private cost of education. In the developing countries, for a vast majority of poor people, the opportunity cost of education is quite high. If they go to school, they have to forego the earnings from work which they can do if they do not go to school. If the wages which they have to forego are thus high, the demand for education will be lesser. Thus, higher the opportunity cost, lower is the demand for education. The non-economic determinants of demand for education area are culture, traditions, social status, education of parents and the size of family, etc. Look into the social versus private benefits and costs of education now. In the given figure, Michael Todaro explains the private costs and the benefits of education. According to Michael P. Todaro, the private cost of primary education is very less, but the private benefit is also less, though it is higher than the cost. The private cost and the benefit of secondary education are both higher than that of primary education. The gap between the private cost and the private benefits is, however, higher than in the case of secondary education. The private benefits from higher or tertiary education rise steeply, while cost of higher education is not much higher than that of secondary education. While the social benefits from the primary education are much higher than the social returns from the higher education, and the social costs of primary education is much lower than the social costs of higher education. Hence, the governments must spend more on primary education and provide at least primary education to all children. Looking now into the supply of education. In most developing countries, governments subsidize primary education as well as secondary and higher educations. Subsidized education raises the demand for education, but the supply of job opportunities do not increase much given the quality of education provided in the developing countries. With subsidized education and higher unemployment, the average educational level among the unemployed rises in an expectation of obtaining a job in the modern sector. And as a tool to compete for jobs, as jobs will be allocated to those with higher levels of education. While the governments in many countries have increased the number of schools, they have not focused on the quality of teachers and education. Education Development Index as calculated by the Human Development Report, the Education Index, that is the EI, is calculated from the expected years of schooling and the mean years of schooling. EYS, the number of years is the child that can expect to spend in a given level of education beginning from the age when he or she enters school and the mean years of schooling. Whereas the MYS, the average number of completed years in education of a population which is 25 years or older. 18 years is the expected years of schooling, which is equivalent to achieving a master's degree in most countries. The maximum years for mean years of schooling is taken as 15, which is the projected maximum mean value. Mean years of schooling, the MYS, is indexed by dividing by 15. The maximum for mean years of schooling, that is 15, is the projected maximum of this indicator for 2025. EI, the education index, is obtained by averaging these two indices. The education index is calculated by the given formula. EI is equal to MYSI plus the EYSI divided by 2, that is the average, whereas MYSI is equal to MYS divided by 15. The EYSI is equal to EYS divided by 18. Hence, in any case, the actual MYS is 15 and the actual EYS is 18. Then, the two indices are 1 and the education index is 1. And if in any case the actual MYS is 0 and the actual EYS is 0, then the two indices are 0 and the education index is 0 again. Thus, the education index ranges between 0 and 1, and 0 indicates the worst performance and 1 indicates the best of performance. Let us now check the education index for some countries and their ranks for the year 2014. The Education for All Development Index is another index which has been given by the UNESCO, and you will be able to see that on the screen. Coming now to health. In the theories of human capital, health is the physical, mental, emotional and spiritual well-being of a person, which has bearing on her ability to work and earn and contribute to development. Greater health capital increases the return on investment in education. The state of health is treated as the stock concept and the contributions of health in individual life to the society as a flow. Like education, health capital entails private as well as public costs and benefits. The stock of health depreciates over time and at an increasing rate in the later life. Now, the investment in health include child care, nutrition, clothing, housing, medical services, use of one's own time and an appropriate mix of work as well as leisure. Some directly measurable indicators of health are average life expectancy, that is ALE, the infant mortality rate, which is IMR, and the child mortality rate, that is CMR. The fertility rate, nutrition, the BMI, that is the body mass index, incidence of diseases and epidemics, birth rates, BR and the death rates, the maternal mortality rates, which is the MMR. It is believed that longer spans of life provide additional incentives to acquire more education as investment for future earnings. An improvement in other health conditions leads to improvement in productivity. In the history of economics, economic growth was always attributed to capital and the other fixed factors and later to knowledge and education. Evaluating economic returns of investment in health is one more recent exercise. Talking about nutrition. In the evaluation of health as a measure of human capital, it must be noted that health does not merely mean absence of disease or mental stability. A disease-free person may not be a healthy person if nutrition is not sufficient. Malnutrition is a disease in itself. Therefore, health investments must not be simply limited to dealing with disease, but must be made to deal with malnutrition also. The independent and private benefits if nutrition pertain to a healthier, wealthier and emotionally and spiritually happier life. Take a look at the instrumental and social benefits that can be surveyed in reduction to absenteeism, longer work lifespan, improvement in productivity, improvement in grasping and retention among children at school. The improvement in retention of in-service training in case of adults and improved interest in farm care and agriculture among farmers. The incurrence of stable nutritional costs effect in cost reduction of medicines and medical facilities. A cost benefit justification must be provided when health investment is discussed in economics. The health and employment, which is good health conditions in highly populated countries that call for better employment opportunities for a healthier labor force. The labor supply and the quality of labor and labor productivity improve with the improved state of health, and hence employment opportunities must not just be increased, but the quality of employment must also be improved. Otherwise, countries may face the consequence of surplus labor and idle labor. Employment creation must outweigh investments in terms of health. Talking about Gender equality. We may ask, do developing countries maintain gender health investments? In developing countries, fewer private costs are incurred on nutrition and health of females than of males. The health issues of a girl child and women are more than often neglected, and hence it becomes a responsibility of the government to increase allocations for improving health conditions of girls and women. As discussed earlier, the deep-rooted beliefs and behavior in a less educated society cannot be invaded easily, and hence governments in developing countries have to spend on creating awareness about the necessity to pay attention on health of women and the gains thereon. Supply of health facilities. Talking about the supply of health facilities, there is a shortage of health facilities in the developing countries. The governments have to invest in health facilities for the poor. Nonetheless, there has always been shortage in developing countries of doctors, nurses, medicines and hospitals. The private health facilities exist along with the government facilities, but these are expensive and beyond the reach of a vast majority of poor in the developing world. Looking at the trade-off, we see some trade-off with regards to the health investments. In the developing countries, the governments have to trade off between the investments in the industrial infrastructure, agricultural infrastructure like irrigation facilities and investments in health and education. The returns from the former two investments are more evident in the short run, but the investments in the social sector can produce evident returns only in the long run. The less developed societies in developing countries more than often trade off nutrition and health expenditures for customary and religious celebrations. Let us check some World Health statistics provided by the WHO or the World Health Organizations. Underweight children. In 2015, 1 in 7 children were estimated to be underweight in less developed regions. High prevalence combined with a large population means that most underweight children, which happens to be 49 million, live in the southern Asia. Talking about water and sanitation, the Millennium Development Goal, that is drinking water target, called for halving or making half of the proportion of the population without sustainable access to safe drinking water between the year 1990 and 2015. This goal was met in 2010, 5 years ahead of the schedule. A 2.6 billion people gained access to improved source of drinking water during this period. While this is a tremendous achievement, efforts should continue to give access to the remaining 663 million people who still rely on unimproved water sources, which is sources of water like lakes, rivers, dams or unprotected dug wells or springs for their drinking, cooking and personal hygiene. Talking about hygiene, 68% of the world's population has access to improved sanitation facilities by the year 2015, and 946 million people practiced open defecation in the year 2015. Maternal mortality. Every day in 2015, about 830 women died due to complications of pregnancy and childbirth. Almost all these deaths occurred in low resource settings, and most could have been prevented. The primary causes of death are hemorrhage, hypertension, infections and indirect causes, mostly due to interaction between pre-existing medical conditions and pregnancy. The risk of a woman in a developing country dying from a maternal related cause during her lifetime is about 33 times higher as compared to a woman living in a developed country. The maternal mortality is a health indicator that shows very wide gaps between the rich and the poor, the urban and the rural areas, both between the countries and within them. Reducing child mortality to achieve Millennium Development Goal. The overall substantial progress has been made towards achieving the Millennium Development Goal of reducing child mortality rate, CMR. The number of under 5 deaths worldwide has declined from about 12.7 million in 1990 to about 5.9 million in 2015. This resulted into 19,000 lesser child deaths per day in 2015 than those in 1990. Talking about tobacco use and exposure, one death every 6 seconds occurs across the globe owing to tobacco use or exposure to tobacco smoke. 22% of the world's population aged 15 plus are smokers. 78% do not smoke. Non-smoking is becoming the norm. 10% of the world's population lives in countries that have sufficiently high tax rates on cigarettes. Looking now into tuberculosis. Tuberculosis or TB is contagious and airborne. It ranks alongside HIV as a leading cause of death worldwide. 9.6 million people are estimated to have fallen ill with TB in 2014. 5.4 million men, 3.2 million women and 1 million children. An estimated 1.2 million people living with HIV developed TB in the year 2014. There have been major advances in prevention, diagnosis and treatment of TB. Mortality has fallen 47% since 1990. Effective diagnosis and treatment of TB saved an estimate 43 million lives between 2000 and the year 2014. Despite these advances and despite the fact that nearly all cases can be cured, TB remains to be one of the world's biggest threats. In the year 2014, TB killed some 1.5 million people, 1.1 million HIV negative and 0.4 million HIV positive people. The toll comprised of 8,90,000 men, 4,80,000 women and 1,40,000 children. 1 in 3 HIV deaths is due to TB. Talking about cholera, in 2015, 1,72,454 cases and 1,304 death cases of cholera were reported to the WHO worldwide. The outbreaks continued to affect several countries. Overall, 41% of the cases were reported from Africa, 37% from Asia and 25% from the Americas. Cholera remains a major public health problem and affects primarily developing world populations with no proper access to adequate water and sanitation resources. Talking now about malaria. Malaria transmission occurs in 5 WHO regions. Globally, an estimated 3.2 billion people in 95 countries and territories are at a risk of being infected with malaria and developing disease, and 1.2 billion are at a high risk. That is, more than one person in a 1,000 people stands a chance of getting malaria in a year. According to the World Malaria Report in 2015, there were 214 million cases of malaria globally in 2015 and 4,38,000 malaria caused deaths. It is time that we summarize the session for today. In this lecture, we understood how and when the demand for education arises, and we also understood about the private and social costs and benefits of education. We further took into the role of good health in human and economic development and the cost and benefits of good health for individuals as well as for the society. We need to remember from this session the various costs and benefits of education and health, the method of measuring an education index, and the importance of nutrition as one of the determinants of good health. With this, we summarize and end today's session. Thank you so much.